Hi everyone. I'm sharing this PowerPoint from the Medicine Hat Women's Shelter Society. Aimee Sarsons was the creator of this PowerPoint. She gave me permission to use it in classes. So I just want to credit Aimee. Thank you so much. Former graduate of the program. So just some information about Medicine Hat Women's Shelter Society, just their guiding principles. One of the big shifts in their programming in recent years has been their response-based focus, which honors that not just women, victims always respond and resist to abuse and violence. Sometimes those little acts of resistance are quite small, but they're always there. And one of the things that they do in their work is really honor that. So family violence. What is family violence? Any violence that occurs in a family unit. And so that's her definition. So different types of violence, physical abuse, and sometimes people don't realize that physical abuse can be things like restraining somebody, pinching somebody, shaking somebody. It doesn't have to be sort of like quote unquote typical types of physical abuse. Driving recklessly, we actually had a fairly significant, well, horribly significant murder-suicide in Medicine Hat a number of years ago that was a result of somebody driving. So hurting pets or destroying property. So those are all different types of physical abuse. Emotional abuse, so any act intended to undermine your emotional well-being. And I would argue this is different from what the slide says, but I would argue that sometimes it's not even intentional. It's the impact. So more and more new research has been around impact. So even if someone doesn't intend to be hurtful, if the end result, the impact of something that somebody said, for instance, is hurtful, then it's abusive. So that's just some recent kind of shift and something that I would maybe argue. But these are some examples of emotional abuse. Put downs, being emotionally unresponsive. Again, people don't think of that. Blaming, isolating, name calling, jealousy, threatening suicide is actually quite common in families and in relationships where there's a high degree of violence. Threatening to hurt pets, destroy property, you'll notice that was on physical, but it's also noted under emotional. Again, these things are not clear cut because obviously it's emotionally very painful, even if there's been a physical assault or, so some of these things are complex. Sexual abuse, all sexual behavior without consent or threats of such behavior. So ridiculing you, pressuring you, coercing sex, demanding sex, forcing a person to commit degrading sexual acts, things that they don't want to do. And then, of course, rape and forced intercourse. Y'all know I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to tell a story here. I was actually at a gathering with a group of women, and we were talking about, oh, maybe we should go out dancing or do something. And one of the women made this comment. She said, well, I have to go. I'm tired, and I have to go home now because it's getting late, and I have to have sex with my husband when I get home, because the only way he allowed me to come here tonight and watch our children was that I agreed that I would have sex with him when I got home. And I was appalled, as you might imagine, and actually, you never stop being a social worker. Pulled her into the bathroom to have a little chat. Anyway, obviously it was kind of a guarded, very quick sort of thing, but just saying, hey, like that bothered me. And, you know, if you ever want to talk about it, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, so to me, that was sexual abuse. So, financial abuse. So anything that leaves you or your children um, with being financially, not having financial security or limits your access to decision making. No access to money, not allowed to work, or the flip, forcing someone to work a lot or multiple jobs, not allowed to have a bank account, sometimes having to account for every single thing or submit your receipts, squandering money that would be for the family on other things, gambling, or other things. So these are all types of financial abuse. Yeah, I was going to give another story, but I'll keep going. um, Spiritual and cultural abuse. So, words or actions that damage you spiritually, or any use of cultural ideas as a way to dominate or control you. So, not allowing you to practice your religion, using scripture to justify abuse, forcing you to go against your beliefs, using religion to control you, threatening to call immigration, taking papers, passports, not allowing access to them, forced marriages. I know that the women's shelter in Medicine Hat has noticed a huge increase in cultural abuse over the last several years. One of the things that they have had where they've had young women fleeing their families because they were going to be forced into marriage. I used to work in Bow Island a number of years ago, and there was a large uh, evangelical based population. There's also a large LDS population and a large Mennonite population, so quite interesting dynamics in those communities. But I worked with a LDS, I worked with an evangelical family who the mom had quite severe postpartum depression, actually had some postpartum psychosis, and had some suicidal ideation. And when asked about her suicidal ideation, the public health nurse made a comment about, well, what would happen to your children? And she said, oh, like, well, I would. She said she would drive her vehicle off a cliff, and then she said, well, what would happen to your children? And the woman's like, well, obviously they would be in the car with me. So yes, this was very concerning. And the part that is quite concerning in terms of this slide is that her partner wanted all interventions, ignored the mental health aspects, and was only wanted faith-based interventions. So using scripture to justify not accessing resources for the family. So wouldn't let the woman be on medication, get counseling. So I would argue that's an abuse of spiritual practices, but interesting. Technology and abuse. This has changed everything for many women. Many people. Sorry, I keep giving the typical example, and I will talk a little bit about that, and we can talk about that together as well. I'm aware that abuse goes all different ways. You have abuse in same-sex marriages. You have abuse in sometimes female partners abuse male partners. Sometimes male partners abuse female partners. But I am going to talk primarily about the typical example that we might think of a male offender, and we'll circle back to that, okay? So, but I just want to be clear that I know that abuse can come in all kinds of forms. But technology and abuse, using technology to stalk partners. I personally know somebody who had a tracking device put on their car. Using I Find Phone or whatever, I Find My iPhone, sending threats and insults through social media, People heard of like the dirty and things like this, where somebody gets completely slandered with all kinds of information, and it's very hard to remove that information. There's actually a really good, really interesting Netflix series. I think it's called The Most Hated Man in the World or something like that. Anyway, about some of the things that can happen when you have technology and abuse. Um, Asking for and sending degrading or sexually explicit photos, stealing or insisting they have your password, checking up on people's phones, monitoring your messages, emails, phone calls, etc. Um, so uh, just some statistics for you on all this. And certainly, I think you would all be aware of the increase in cyberbullying. And certainly, if we look at LGBTQ people, more information has come out again that how high risk that group of youth is in particular for bullying and for subsequent challenges, higher risk of suicide, etc., due to how people are treated and the stigma and fear surrounding all of that. So those are just some types of abuse. Abuse is not caused by, but can be complicated by drugs or alcohol, a nagging partner, anger, a loss of control, mental illness. So the philosophy at the food bank, or the food bank, sorry, at the women's shelter is that abuse is a choice about how to treat people. People can use drugs or alcohol and not be abusive. People can have a nagging partner and not be abusive. People can struggle with dealing with their anger and not be abusive. People can be mentally ill and not be abusive. So when those things are used to justify, um, it's important to kind of look at this. The other piece is we know that people who abuse will not act violently in all situations. So if someone goes to work and responds with frustration to an event, we know that they're capable of responding appropriately to frustration at work. So what's different when they don't respond appropriately in a different setting, right? So um, we're just going to talk a little bit about the cycle of violence. So this is a term that we use when there's this tension building phase, and then, first there's like a honeymoon phase, then the tension starts to build, and then there's some kind of a critical incident. And we do kind of see that there's like a spiraling. So when the women's shelter came, I'm just going to read the note here. It said, when we talked about the cycle, though, or when other people talk about the cycle, it can sound like the victim is to blame for staying, and the person who is abusive doesn't really have control of their actions and can't be blamed. But in reality, it's much more of a cycle. In fact, at the shelter, we're in the process of new training, and again, they're looking at that response-based training. So when we look at the cycle of violence, like, it is complex and it isn't so simple, but one of the things that I think is really important to note is that um, it's not all bad, because sometimes people, this is the common phrase, like, why don't they just leave? Well, if it was just bad all the time and it was always chronically bad, people would leave. But obviously it's very complex and there are lots of issues and reasons why people don't. But one of the reasons that I think it's really um, under, I'm like, I don't know, not represented well, is that there are lots of times that are really good in people's lives too. So um, yeah, but there is this cycle where we see where there's a honeymoon, a tension building, and a critical incident. What we do know about domestic violence is that over time, these incidents become closer and closer together. So there's less of a honeymoon period, the tension building takes less time, and there's more critical incidents. The other thing that often happens is that the critical incidents become more and more severe over time. All right. So the response-based model really looks at abuse in a little bit of a different way. We'll talk about the power and control wheel after, but also the cycle of violence. Um, but both of those, according to this model, don't honor the resistance the victim uses in the context of abuse. So really, basically what this is social material conditions is what's the client living in right now. So for assuming, they just give this an example. What is their income? Do they work? What's their gender? Were they born in Canada? Do they have refugee or immigrant status? How are the family dynamics, relationships? All of these things will shape how the client is responding to abuse, which of course they will. Person and environment, it's all core stuff around social work, understanding and practice. Social interactions. So what was going on when the violence occurred? Were there other people there? Where did it happen? All the different pieces around that. The offender actions. What did the client experience? Again, this is from the notes from the women's shelter. In talking with the client or hearing their story, try to develop clear descriptions of the events or actions that concern the client. In cases of violence, describe the actions of the offender and tell it like it is. For example, if the client states, he or she hit me, then respond back after he or she hit you, rather than when that happened, what did you do, or something like that. So describe the unilateral nature of violence. And then the victim responds resistance. Explore with the social, mental, physical responses of the client, starting from the beginning at the adverse event. Try to grasp the situational logic of the situation. So victim responses assistance really is empathy, like just trying to put yourself in the position, but sometimes the victim will resist mentally. They'll say, well, I knew this was happening, but this is what I did in my mind. So that's an act of resistance. Maybe the person will do something physical. Sometimes that's fighting back, which is very complex and messy, but sometimes that's like going to another room, phoning someone, being in a public space, leaving the house and being outside where there was witnesses. All kinds of things like that that people can do to sort of be, it can be reframed for them, that they were responding in a way that was both trying to keep themselves safe, but also with a little act of resistance. The social response. So how do or did people respond to the person during and after the event? So that was if there's witnesses. And if you're talking to someone who's experienced abuse, then your response also becomes part of the social response. So just be mindful about that. And then responses to social responses. So how does the person respond? So when you said, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you, if that's what you said, and then how did the client respond? How did the person who experienced the domestic violence respond? Sorry, just going through. So those are just that's sort of like leading you through the stages and the examples of response-based analysis. So helping us look a little deeper around the context and the circumstances can help us understand all the pieces of the dynamics around domestic violence. How children respond to abuse. So we used to think, which seems sort of dumb, for lack of a better word now, that if kids experience domestic violence, but it didn't actually happen to them, that they were not victims, like unless they actually got hit or they actually got yelled at and whatever. But we absolutely have evidence to indicate that is fundamentally not true. Actually, in fact, witnessing domestic violence in some cases has indicated that is actually more damaging than actually experiencing some of the violence. But it's interesting because lots of times if there's violence in the home, people think that the kids have no idea, but the reality is that 80 to 90% of children who are in homes where violence took place indicated they were aware of the violence. So what do we see behaviorally in kids and emotionally in kids when there's domestic violence in the home? These are some of the things. One of the biggest things we'll see is a delay or a regression developmentally. So kids who could previously do something or previously had a certain developmental level regress significantly. And of course, we also know that there are good old social learning theory. If you grow up with domestic violence, you're more likely, if you're a male, to become an offender if it was your father who was the offender, and you're more likely to become a victim if you're a female and if it was your mother who was a victim. So we know it increases risk in many, many, many different ways. I'm not going to show this. There's a really incredible, moving, actually quite horrific 911 call. It's a real 911 call. It is available if you want to look for it. I used to show it. I used to do it because I believed it was so impactful, and it really, truly is. But I stopped because it's so impactful. It's traumatizing actually for some people to hear. I think it maybe is for me to hear. So in the video, in the 911 call, the actual taped 911 call, the mother actually dies at the expense of the male partner, and the child is in the home. So it's pretty horrible, but it is very impactful. Just some statistics here for you. We do know that COVID has seen an increase in domestic violence. So actually some of these stats are a little bit old, so probably most of these stats would be increased now. Just some more stats for you. I guess I'll use this opportunity to talk specifically about this stat. In every 6 days in Canada, a woman is killed by her intimate partner. Out of 83 police report homicides, 67 of the victims, over 80% were women. And that is why context is important when we're talking about domestic violence. And actually, one of my personal kind of issues and challenges is when we talk about family violence as a sort of paint it all with the same brush. If you go back and think about your Social Work 100 course, and we talked about oppression, and we talked about the different forms of oppression. We talked about marginalization. We talked about violence. We talked about all those different pieces. Go back and look at your Mullally reading. To me, that is why it's very difficult to talk about family violence in one snapshot, because we live in a patriarchal society, and I do believe that the dynamics around violence against women, if we look at this idea of stereotypical male against female domestic violence, I do believe the dynamics are very different than same-sex relationship violence and female to male violence. So I'm not negating that those things don't happen. I absolutely know they happen, but the dynamics are very different. And to me, the statistics are really different as well, especially when we look at that number around. It's actually more dangerous in Canada to be a woman in a violent domestic relationship than it is to serve in the armed forces. Your chances of ending up dead are greater than they are if you're a soldier. So, yeah, patriarchy. The consequences are different and the dynamics are different. We kind of alluded to a little bit this before, but that whole why don't they just leave? It's so complex, but there's many reasons why women don't leave. If we're especially going back to that stereotypical kind of scenario, but they want to be in a relationship. They believe the person can change. Oh my God, I feel like social workers are such good victims because of this, because we're strength-based and because we believe so much that people can change, and they can. I mean, we shouldn't be social workers if we don't believe that. Um, when you that can make that you tolerate things you shouldn't tolerate. Sometimes for religious or personal beliefs, I want my kids to have two parents, or I believe I made this oath to God. Um, Feelings of love, feelings of shame, feelings of guilt, feelings of embarrassment. I know somebody who was married 3 times, and the last relationship was incredibly abusive. And she just felt like she could not leave because she had already been labeled as sort of like sexually promiscuous, and like sort of like she's flighty, and here she was on her 3rd marriage. And I mean, it's so incredibly tragic when you feel like you're stuck and you can't leave. So people believe the abuse will stop. There's fear. I mean, women have seen the escalation, and we've all heard incidents when somebody leaves, and that's when we know that people are at the highest risk, when they're threatening to leave. So there's just the fear, the reality. Women are isolated. Sometimes there's just a huge lack of support. I give this example. If something horrible happened to me tonight in my home, I think about all the supports and places I have and people I could go to. I have so many friends and colleagues and coworkers. I'm sure some of you would open your home to me and say, Callie, you know what? You can come and stay with me for a couple days. I have 3 credit cards. I can go stay in a hotel. I can drive my own vehicle. I have a driver's license. I can go to another city. I have friends and family in other places. I have people who would come and pick me up. I mean, I have tons of resources, tons of resources. I am privileged with resources. So I want you to think about that for yourself and all the resources you have. Now, there are multiple reasons why somebody might go to shelter. Maybe it's a safety issue. Maybe it's, lots of other things. But sometimes the reason why they go to shelter is they literally don't have those other resources. So I have so many options, but some people don't. So I think about that. I think about, for me, the answer to leave is a little different. I can support myself. I make a good income, right? But not everybody has all those pieces. So there's a lot. There's a lot there. And sort of the other side of this coin is when people leave, why did they go back? And there again, it's just an infinite number of reasons. It might be kids. It might be that when you left, things were so hard. I know people who have had to give up so much when they left, financially, um, prestige, things in the community, and so they just decided to go back or to live with. So it can be very complicated. Just some of the things that people face when they're struggling, and some of the responses that people have when they experience abuse. I'm getting close to half an hour. I'm aware, and I'm trying not to go that long. So, some things to know about working with people who experience abuse, experience violence. Setting up a safety plan is really important. Um, so people are experts in their own life, and we can't assume what will work for one person will work for everyone else. So there's all different kinds of safety plans, and the responsibility really needs to be, and the ownership needs to be with the individual setting up the plan. So these are some basic principles that you want to acknowledge the violence. So if someone discloses to you, you want to make sure that you acknowledge that you hear that and that you believe the person. You're clear that the person who committed the violence is responsible for their actions, not the victim, and you want to make sure that you reinforce that. You can acknowledge the victim's resistance to violence if you're able, if it's appropriate, and challenge victim blaming, like it's all my fault, I should have known better, it's my fault, he got mad, he doesn't like it when the house is a mess, etc. You also want to be very careful to respect the person's choices, and you also want to tell it like it is. So don't offer false promises, don't make promises you can't keep. Just be clear and concise and truthful. So what are some ways that you can help? You can help by providing a helpline, by providing information about Phoenix Safe House, about Musasa House. The Women's Shelter has an outreach program. They will work with people if you just are kind of interested in getting more information and want to go for coffee. They'll do that. SFIT, which is part of if there's a domestic violence call, then people will be sent out to the home. Obviously, community education and awareness. There's a children's support team. There's groups, all different pieces that are a part of services offered. And obviously there's lots of community resources because everybody works together, and there's many different avenues for help, and in many different places where people experience domestic violence need help and support. And then there's time for questions. However, this is a recorded thing, so you don't get time for questions. Sorry about that. But basically, I just wanted to leave you with this is just a little bit of a snapshot. And I'm also going to get you to explore the power and control wheel and look at that in a little bit more in depth. So there'll be another thing for you to connect to. So thank you so much.